Thank you very much. First of all, let me thank Tim and Carolyn and Debbie for setting this up. I'm very grateful to be here. And it is very important for me to keep talking about this fire. It has obsessed me for many, many years. And I want to emphasize, I continue to learn things about it. I might even learn something during this presentation. Now, let's see if I can advance the slides. I think we're going to start with a little movie. Okay. I consider this fire a generational trauma. My name is Stephanie Schorow, and I am a writer based in Boston, and I've written a number of books, including a book on the Coconut Grove nightclub fire of 1942. 490 people died in that fire. Hundreds were injured. Hundreds more escaped. There were firefighters affected. There were nurses and doctors affected. There were cab drivers affected. Passers-by were affected. There's a couple reasons why Coconut Grove has just maintained interest. One is that there's still mysteries about the fire. We really still don't know exactly what caused it, although we're pretty sure it was caused by a busboys match. But we don't really know why it spread so quickly and was so devastating. There was something functionally wrong with almost every single exit out of the place. A lot of the victims of the Coconut Grove were caught by doors that open inward. So people died as much from the problems with the structure as from the fire itself. Massive amounts of people were being pulled out, were being rescued. Ambulances were carrying people, taxis, passers-by were being asked to take people to hospital, At one point, there was someone arriving every 11 seconds at Boston City Hospital, and a lot of them died right away. What really punches me in the gut was the arbitrariness of the people who lived and people who died. Looking through these pictures of the people who lost their lives in the fire and what they could have been and what could have happened for them, and just to go through the picture after picture and just looking at these faces and thinking to myself, all these people died for what? It's not as if we didn't know things were dangerous. In other words, locking a door from the inside out, that was dangerous. But it was after the Coconut Grove that the municipalities and communities had the political will to enforce these codes. I'll go and give a talk about this fire, and people will come up with stories about the fire. Most people have a variation of this story, which is, Coconut Grove, you know, my grandfather was going to go to that club that night, and at the last minute they decided they were going to go to a movie. And if they'd gone to the club, I wouldn't be here. And I've heard so many variations of that, of the near miss, so that even if people weren't directly affected, they feel as if they were, and then these stories emerge. So it is something that is really in the collective memory of Boston. Plus, it's in the collective memory of a lot of firefighters and people who are in the firefighting community around the country and around the world. I think this generational trauma is overlooked in the sense that people don't quite see the impact it has over the years. This was not an event that happened and then we're done with it and moved on. This is an event that continues to have ripple effects through the years. There's something about the idea of people out for a good time, just to escape the war, escape the cold, and then caught in this maelstrom of death and destruction. I think that resonates today. All right. Thank you so much for watching that. There's some really rare footage of the club in its heyday. And so I'm going to start off by giving you a little background on the Coconut Grove fire, because I have gone back to the well on this story 3 times. In other words, I wrote about it in my first book, I wrote about it in 2005, and then I revised the book. And part of the reason was because I kept finding out new information and I kept being intrigued. And one of the intriguing factors is the stories of the survivors and their family. People would come up to me with stories that I really felt like I had to share. And then plus the lingering mysteries of this fire. It is of unknown origin officially. So we're still trying to decide exactly what happened and why it was so bad. To understand the Coconut Grove, I want to give a little background on the club. It was the brainchild of two entrepreneurs who took an old garage, and you can kind of see the footprint of the club right there. They took an old garage and they created a nightclub and a nightclub complex out of it in the theater district of Boston. They were Jacques Renard and Mickey Albert, and they put together this club back in 1927, and they just knew it was going to be a hit. They created a South Seas paradise in the middle of Boston based on the Coconut Grove Hotel in Los Angeles. So they moved that concept to Boston and put it together. Now, you can see right away there are fake palm trees. There's you can kind of see the ceiling of the Coconut Grove could actually open up, so people could literally dance under the stars, and that was one of the aspects of this club. It had one main entrance, and that was right under the sign here, and that was a revolving door that would let people in. So that's how most people came in and out of the club. But you can see right away there's a lot of combustible people there. And there's also one problem that prevented the club from becoming successful, and that was prohibition, which prevented them from selling liquor. So the two guys who started the club soon had to sell out to this gentleman, a gangster named Charles Solomon, known as King Solomon, who took over the club. And he established a lot of the practices that resonated later during the fire. For example, they keep the doors locked inside and out, make sure people don't run out on their bills. And that was very important to him because he was always wanted to make sure he got all his money. He was also concerned about his own personal safety. And well, he should be, because one night Solomon was in another club and he was approached by four gentlemen who shot him. It may have been robbery, it may have been another mob hit, we don't know, but he ended up succumbing to his wounds and actually died saying, "They got me, those dirty rats." And yes, that is true. That is not out of a movie, but it sounds like it was. Now, the club at that point then moved to this gentleman, Barney Wilansky, who was Solomon's lawyer. He took over the club and expanded it and made it a real thriving business. And this was after Prohibition was lifted, so he could really make a good profit. Now, here's the thing to keep in mind about the Coconut Grove. It was not one big room. It was a series of rooms. Wilansky was able to, this is the original club here, the dance floor. He added another bar here, Wilansky did. And then below, this is the lower level, he created something called the Melody Lounge, which was almost like a speakeasy, but it was a downstairs from the main club. And then just about 10 days before the fire, he opened this new cocktail lounge on the other side of the building. It was on the faces Broadway, so a lot of people called it the Broadway Lounge. But as you can see, the club was a series of rooms. The building itself had originally been a garage. It was used as a film distribution area, and then it was turned to a nightclub. Whether that would happen today, probably not. But the new lounge, something to be said about that new lounge that I showed you. It was only accessible by door to the public. It was only accessible by doors on that fronted onto Broadway. Those doors, there were two doors leading in. One opened outward with the flow of traffic, and one opened inward. The inner door opened inward, which became a very important point during the trial. Now, the club was actually inspected just a few days, just about 10 days before the fire, and it was okayed. And in fact, the inspector who went there said later that he lit a match, he held it up to a palm tree, and it did not ignite. So his feeling was that the club was safe. He was later indicted for that. He beat the rap on that. We'll talk about that in a minute. But the point is that it was inspected, it was considered to be in good shape. But let's go to the night of November 28th, 1942. And this is a very Boston thing. Let me just share this. That day, there was a football game between Boston College and Holy Cross. And it was a big deal for Boston. It was played in the iconic Fenway Park. And Boston College was supposed to win that game, but instead they lost to Holy Cross. And there's a mythology that people were going to celebrate the Boston College victory at the Coconut Grove, but since they lost, they didn't go. That's actually a myth, but again, it reiterates that feeling that a lot of people, more people could have been affected by this fire. Now, and this is the interesting thing that the BC was routed 55-12. It was a really bad loss. People still talk about it in Boston. Now, in the club that night, it was packed. Mickey Albert, the guy who originally started the club, was actually back. He was actually the host of the club that night. There were so many people in the club. Patrons, there were people celebrating anniversaries. There were servicemen. There were people on dates. There were people as young as 16 years old because the club, ironically, was licensed as a restaurant, not as a nightclub, so that young people below the age of 21 could go in there. Now, not only in addition to the club's patrons, there were entertainers there were singers there was wait staff, there was a huge number of people. In fact, we think that there were probably more than 1,000 people in the club that night. The club was licensed for maybe 600 people, more than 1,000 patrons, and then the full supply of the staff and musicians. There was one special guest, and that was this gentleman, Buck Jones, who was a star of 166 cowboy movies, and he was quite popular at that time. And he was in Boston on a bond tour. Remember, it's during the war, so he was on a bond tour. He was promoting his movies. He really didn't want to go to the club that night, but some movie executives convinced him to go. And he went because he was a good cowboy and he did his duty. So he was at the club that night. Now, let me go through the timeline. About 10:15 a.m. in that downstairs Melody Lounge, a busboy was told to put in a light bulb in one of those fake palm trees. A serviceman had unscrewed it to give him a little more darkness for him and his girlfriend. The busboy was told, go put the light bulb in. He couldn't see it, so he lit a match to see where he could put in the light bulb, and he put it back in. Immediately after that, fire was seen in that downstairs Melody Lounge. Downstairs Melody Lounge had a cloth, had a fake ceiling, a cloth that covered the ceiling, and the palm tree started burning, the ceiling cloth started burning. And at first it was funny, and then patrons down there realized that that part of the club was on fire. So they started to rush up the stairs to get out. They got to the top of the stairs. Many of them rushed out, went to the revolving door to get out. There was also a door at the top of the stairs that had a panic bar attached to it, an exit. It was bolted shut or locked or something. They could not get there. So as the patrons were running up the stairs, they were followed by the fire. The fire, which was described as a huge kind of fireball, moved up the stairs and rushed into that main lounge. And in just 3 minutes or so, that main dining area was filled with fire and smoke. Now, here's the interesting thing as well, that fire spread into that new Broadway lounge by 10:20, it's estimated. So it went through the whole club and into through a series of rooms and to the next part of the club. And then, ironically enough, let's see if I can do this. The first victims actually made it to the hospital by 10:35 p.m. And the fire, ironically enough, was considered out by 10:45 p.m. So we're talking about a very, very quick event. This is a good illustration of how the flames moved. You can see it started in the Melody Lounge with the green line. The fire roared up the stairs and then roared into the main area and then all the way into the new lounge. Now, this is why there was such a high loss of life. Many people ran to that revolving door to get out. There were so many people trying to get out that it jammed. A lot of people tried to get out the door on the Shawmut Street side. There was a problem with the door. It was hidden. It was locked. They had to break it down to get out there. In the cocktail lounge, the inner door opened inward so that a lot of people got out, but there was such a crush of people getting out. They pressed the door shut and they got locked into that area. Moving forward, there was, as I've said in the thing, something functionally wrong with all the exits, nearly all the exits in the club. And you can see, I put little locks there. If you can see my thing, this door was barred at the top. This door was covered. This was a revolving door. It jammed. This door was hard to get open. There was some areas to get out for the staff. And there were problems. These were locked from the inside. This door was covered up, and this door opened inward. So something was functionally wrong. One of my colleagues in the National Fire Protection Association, a man I've had a lot of discussions with, he calls it a perfect storm because there was just something wrong with all the parts of the building. I'm going to see if I can play a little movie here that will describe this man's escape from the fire that night.
When did you know something was wrong?
Well, when I heard some rumbling, I was up in my dressing room. That was on the roof level. And I heard some commotion. So I opened up the door to look down to see what was going on down below. I figured there would be a big fight. There was a football, that there was a rumble. Well, as I went down the stairs, all of a sudden there was a big cloud of smoke and sparks and the flames and the smoke. So I said, ooh, I'm going to go back in my dressing room and I'm going to get my stuff, gather it all up, my tap shoes, my tuxedo, my camel hair coat, which was my pride and joy, and I was going to go off the roof because I figured that's where I had to go off the roof because I wasn't going down there, down below. When a man come through the door, running, put his hands up and ran right through a window, took it right out, the whole plexus. And of course, when I saw that and the smoke behind him, I said, this is no place for Marshal Cole. I'm getting out of here fast, so I followed him through the window. But by that time, the chorus girls and everybody came out behind me because I went out through the window. And of course, we were looking for a way to get off the roof. You had to get off the roof. So when you get out on the roof, I knew there was flames to the left of me because that's where I saw the smoke and the flames. But then there was flames at the other end too, and I'm saying, oh my God, there's fire everywhere. There's fire underneath me. There must be fire. We got to get off here fast. So we found a ladder, small ladder that fell short of the rooftop. So there were three fellows that helped held the ladder. So the chorus girl started to go down the ladder.
When did you know something was wrong?
Sorry. So that was Marshall Cole, who survived the fire. So you can see the description. There were many people who were able to escape, but many people were trapped in the fire. This is one of the rare pictures of the fire because the firefighters got there fairly quickly because they were actually putting out a fire nearby, ironically enough, and managed to control the fire. And then it turned into more of a rescue operation. Again, the fire has been described as a fireball that moved through the club very quickly. So for a long time, there was speculation there was some sort of accelerant that pressed it going forward. But the point was many people were succumbed not necessarily by the fire, but by the fumes, because a lot of the furnishings in the club started to burn and gave off a lot of a lot of material that got in their lungs. Many people were felled by the hot air. They'd fall down. Some people actually suffocated because the fire took up all the oxygen in the air, so they actually suffocated. Other people were, of course, burned, but many people were felled by the heated air getting in their lungs, getting out of the club and being hit by the very cold air, and then they'd fall down. So it was a massive, massive casualty event. People were brought to the nearby hospitals where the medical community immediately got together and really rushed to help out. Ironically enough, medical community had been training for such an event because of the war. So they immediately put in those plans and put in the efforts of everybody involved. Huge amounts of medical people came to the hospital. Some were actually there for a holiday party, but they went to work and tried to save as many of the victims as they could. The club total, the total number of deaths was extremely high. And it took a while to determine that because there were a lot of people who survived, a lot of people succumbed to their wounds sometime later. So it was very difficult to determine the actual number of deaths. We have set it, and by that, a committee has looked at the number of people. They set the total number of fatalities as 490. And that includes one suicide, which I'll talk about in a minute. But there were a huge number of people also injured into the fire. So these are some pictures of it. This is what I was talking about in this movie, the sense of loss for all these people who died just because they were out for a good night on the town. One little side note, the Coconut Grove was whites only, not officially, but in practice. And so many Black people who lived in Boston at the time could not go there. But there were at least 3 African Americans who were at the club that night as employees. One of them tragically died. That was Mr. Plenty, he was called, who was actually there working. He wasn't there regularly, but he was there that night to help out. A coat check woman named Mrs. Vera Daniels was very seriously injured. She later recovered. And then one other woman who managed to escape without any injury. But it's interesting that the color bar was said to maybe save people's lives in the African American community there. Now, the city took immediate action. A little bit late. They banned dancing. They banned floor shows. They started to close up 100 and the thousands of nightclubs that were in the area, and the hotels started closing them up. Well, as a lot of people noted, this was a little too late. This is many people noted that, well, you're doing it now, but you should have done it earlier. And of course, an investigation started, and there's some questions whether that investigation really explored all the details of that caused that fire. Now, one of the things I want to mention were the people who were killed. It was across the board. Patrons were killed, staff were killed, musicians were killed, and Buck Jones, the Hollywood star, he also died in the fire. There were at least 50 servicemen who died in the fire. There was 4 brothers from one family who died in the fire. There was an entire wedding party who had been there that evening to celebrate, and all of them died in the fire. 160 injured. Many of them took months and months to recover. And then one of the survivors, a young man named Frank Gaterna, his wife had died in this fire. Everybody in his party, including his wife, died in the fire, and he felt so guilty that a few months after the fire, he jumped out of a window of a hospital and committed suicide, and his name is included in terms of the victim count. So it was a fire that had an immense impact on the whole area. So what caused the fire? It seemed very obvious at the beginning. The busboy lit a match, ignited the palm tree, and then that fire spread from the downstairs, the upstairs. But almost immediately, there was some sense that not one match could cause all this trouble. Particularly Stanley Tomaszewski, the busboy, came forward. He was very forthright about what he did, very sorry for it. And the fire department and the investigators did not try to pin the blame on him, as that might have been the case in another circumstance. In fact, there was some feeling that the busboy could not have started the fire. How could such a huge fire be started by just one match and spread through this whole building? So there's been other theories over the years. There was idea that maybe film was left over. It had been a film distribution area, it had been a garage. Maybe there were other things that were left over. The combustion from the club furnishings, this is something that has been looked at quite a bit. The palm trees, there was rattan furniture there. There was something called leatherette. There was a leatherette covering of some of the furniture, and that burned. And there was some feeling that that burning of that material gave off almost a mysterious gas that either caused the lung injuries they saw or were part of the whole reason there was a huge fireball going through the club. There was even some feeling that there was sabotage by German agents, or maybe Wolanski, the owner of the club, who was kind of connected with some organized crime, like previously King Solomon, maybe his enemies came in and deliberately set the fire. Years later, there was another theory that speculated that a refrigerator unit that was being used downstairs, the freon in that unit was replaced by something called methyl chloride as a cooling agent. The idea behind this theory is that this methyl chloride leaked out of the refrigerator unit, somehow got ignited, and that created the fireball that spread through the club. Now, methyl chloride is combustible and it does produce a kind of fireball that you see that was seen in the club. However, it is considered to be heavier than air, and it doesn't explain why the fire moved up the stairs and into the rest of the club. So none of these theories have been proven. They're all speculation at this point. But that does not prevent people from looking at other theories. And let's take a look at some of the photographic evidence. For example, this is the corner where the fire started. And you can see the palm tree there is completely burned up. The ceiling, the wall covering over the ceiling is completely gone. But you can also see that there are still some combustible people in area, some things that could burn in the club are still there, like the chairs, like the wooden walls. The thing about the Coconut Grove fire is it did not reach in any section of the club what firefighters, and you're more familiar with this than I am, flashover. It didn't get so hot that everything burned. It was more like a fire that moved through the club but at an amazing, amazing speed. This is the main dining area. And you notice that there was a hole in the ceiling there that was burned, and that was a lot of that was from firefighters trying to vent the fire. Again, a lot of combustible material is still left there. Now, what's interesting is that even fake palm trees did not burn. Much of the other material burned, but it did not. As again, the fire inspector had said that he had tested the palm trees, held up a match, they did not burn. Were they really fire retardant? This was a question that was explored after the fire. This is the remains of the revolving door, and you can see this area is pretty well burned. This is the revolving door that jammed, and people could not get out here, and you can see how bad the fire was in this particular area. This is the new lounge. This was at the other side of the building, and you can see the damage that it caused. Picture on one side is before the fire, after the fire. You can also see there's glue dripping from the ceiling there that some people speculate that may have played a role, but that's kind of hard to determine at this point. Here's another close-up of that. But you can see, even though this was at the other end of the club, how badly it was burned. Now, in a conversation with Casey Grant, who I mentioned of the National Fire Protection Association, they have done some studies on why the fire moves so quickly. Concluded nothing. They've tried to computer model it. They've tried other techniques. It's still a mystery. But we did talk about this thing. This is a foyer of the club looking toward one end that fronted on Church Street. You can see the arrows that this goes downstairs to the Melody Lounge. You can see the arrow that indicates where the revolving door is. Notice the ceiling. Casey speculates that the fire came up from the Melody Lounge, was shot through this because of the configuration of the ceiling, that it somehow projected the fire into the main dining room, and that's what caused it to shoot forward. Again, we don't know. Computer modeling might be able to determine that. Again, it's the concern about the difficulties of doing studies so many years after the fact. Were the decorations to blame? For example, here are some headlines from that time. The decorations may have contributed to it. In fact, in a conversation with former fire chief of Boston, Paul Christian, he says, he's been to a lot of fires and things burn up, project. That could have caused this massive fireball. We don't need to look for a mystery gas or mystery accelerant. This is what happened. There's questions whether all this material could have caused that big fireball, but it was tested. There's also determinations after the fire that there was no training for the staff. Nobody knew what to do in a fire. And again, there was something functionally wrong with all the exits. And the other thing is, when they did get some of those doors open, the fire, seeking oxygen, roared out some of those windows. So it was difficult for people, A, to get out and for firefighters to get in. The other thing that came out after the fire is that a lot of electrical work had been done by unlicensed electricians. And Wolanski had hired people, not gotten the proper permits. This all came out after the fire, that there was a lot of people doing work there at the club who should not have been. They were not licensed. Was that material in the club actually fireproof? A reporter actually snuck in and tried to light a match to see if something would burn, and there was a lot of speculation about that. My understanding, it was inconclusive. There was some idea that meant much of the material there was not properly treated. But again, mystery, some of the palm trees did not burn, while other material did. So, the official cause of the fire is of unknown origin. The busboy, as you can read here, was exonerated, said could not have been caused by him. And this is one of the reasons why I think there has not been a closure on this fire, why it continues to be a generational trauma, because there's no consensus on what actually caused the fire. Now, the fire, however, had major impact in a number of different areas. The medical area, it set legal precedents, safety rule enforcement, and even psychological breakthroughs. For example, you can see here the amount of combustible material in this club. At that time, this club, it was actually considered a restaurant, not a club, but afterwards, nightclubs and restaurants became places of assembly. We're now under the code of places of a public assembly, and so they were subject to stricter codes. So they had to be more careful about exits, about flammable material, and other things. Now, it's not as if this people or safety professionals did not know about these problems. Even before the fire, the NFPA had issued some in its safety code suggestions, said every revolving door should have 2 regular doors, swing doors next to it, or at least one, to make sure if there's a jam on that door that people are able to get out. So it was known that revolving doors could be a problem. But it was only after the fire that cities, municipalities had the political will to enforce some of these codes, including revolving doors. In fact, in Boston, whenever I go through a revolving door, I always make a quick check. Is there a door there? Is there a door there? And I think people in Boston particularly are very vigilant about having other doors around every revolving door. Now, there were legal precedents set. You would think after a fire like this, there would be a lot of lawsuits, and there were, and 10 people were indicted, but only 3 of them actually went to trial. The others were acquitted, or not acquitted, but they were let go. The 3 people went to trial were Barney Wolanski, who owned the club, his brother James Wolanski, who was in the club that night. Barney Wolanski was not even at the club. He was in the hospital because he had a lot of medical problems. And then one wine steward, Jacob Goldfein. And apparently he was the wine steward who tried to prevent patrons from leaving when the fire was first reported, saying, no, you can't go out till you pay your bill. 3 of them were put on trial, but only Barney Wolanski was found guilty. He was found guilty of manslaughter. This was a very important precedent because he was not even at the club that night, but his club was kept in unsafe conditions, so he could be held liable for this. This is one of the first times that property owners were held accountable. In the famous Triangle waistband factory, the one in New York that killed about 140 people, including a lot of young women, the owners were not held accountable. But in this case, at least one Coconut Grove owner was held accountable, and this produced a legal precedent that's used today. It was used in the Station Nightclub fire. It's been used in many other cases. I often give talks, and law students come up and talk to me about how they study this case. Barney was sentenced to 12 to 15 years. He didn't serve all of it. He was pardoned by the mayor of Boston, who was now the governor, and he went home to die as a very ill man. His life was broken, basically. Now, the medical impact is very interesting because penicillin was a new drug. It was used in the military, but a supply was rushed to Boston to use on the victims because there was huge problems with infection with all these burns. It was used topically, not orally, so it's a little unclear how much impact it had, but it kind of opened the door to the age of antibiotics. There were many innovations that were taken for burn and lung treatments. The burn treatments in particular were innovated. There were new methods for treating burns. They were innovated, particularly at Mass General Hospital, which involved a new way of covering wounds with a mixture of gauze, boric acid, and petroleum that was covered. And this proved to be such an effective treatment for burns that is actually something in use today. And many physicians and medical researchers have said that the Coconut Grove was an event that really changed the way we treat burns going forward. So that had a major, major impact. The other issue was the lung injuries. There was some speculation in the beginning that there was some sort of mystery fume that was either in the accelerant or that was released by the burning of the leatherette or the other material in the club. There was something called acrolein that was considered to be maybe an offshoot that was causing all these lung injuries. A lot of people looked into this, but in the long run, it was determined that inhalation injury is just general inhalation injury, which can be very bad, and this was documented. And this is, for example, shows you the lungs of a 16-year-old victim and the edema that developed after the fire with the problems in the lungs. So the lung injuries, there was much research done on that, and the way we treat lung injuries is affected by what happened at this fire. Now, the psychological impact cannot be denied as well. Dr. Eric Lindemann, he was already known for his intervention work in crisis patients and loss of what we now describe as post-traumatic shock. Another woman, Dr. Adler, was also involved in this research, but he did some very significant studies on the Coconut Grove victims, and he discovered that many of them who survived, and even those who did not have real severe injuries, were affected emotionally and psychologically for months, even years after the fire. For example, this is one of his cases. It's the same 16-year-old girl. She survived the fire, but she lost both her parents, and her boyfriend's father were killed in the fire. She was discharged after 3 weeks. She seemed cheerful. She seemed like she was ready to go. But at the end of the 10 weeks, she then entered a true period of grief, feeling of emptiness. And Dr. Lindemann also looked at the case of Frank Caterna, the man who committed suicide. So these are some of the first descriptions of this, what we now call post-traumatic shock, which has led to innovations in helping people in wars and in other places. The girl involved, who I later identified, was Anne Clark, and this is a little newspaper story about her and their difficulty. But let me end on a more cheerful note. This is Anne Clark when I interviewed her in 2012. She survived the fire. She later married, had children, had grandchildren, and I think even great-grandchildren. So she went on to a very productive life. This is a picture of her holding her picture of her parents who she lost in the fire. And this is another picture of her. She returned once to the site of the Coconut Grove in 2013. There was, at that point, you can see in the background there, a dedication for a street in that area, which was renamed Coconut Grove Lane to be a memorial to this fire. And she came to this event. She later died at the age of 90, but you can see her with her sister and with, I think, one of her grandchildren there. Let me reiterate that the Coconut Grove represents a generational trauma. Again, people always approach me. This is a young man who approached me. He said his great uncle died in the fire, and he still carries the wall that was found on his body after the fire. The next slide is of Phyllis Capone Cavan. She was only 1.5 years old when her Uncle Charlie died. Now, she has memories of him, and she continues to mourn his loss. And here she is at the site of the Coconut Grove with a picture of him for one of the events that are held yearly at the site in memorial. So she is still remembering him. Now, there have been some new developments in this case, and I think they're very important to mention. This is the site of the Coconut Grove today. It is covered by, of course, luxury condominiums. This was built not without some controversy, but the site was a parking lot for a long time, and now it's been built up. There was a plaque to the victims that was inserted in the sidewalk of the street where the Coconut Grove was located. It was located originally right around the site of the revolving doors. And interesting enough, this plaque was designed by a young man, Tony Mara, who survived the fire. He survived the fire and he became a metal worker, and he helped to create and design this plaque. And that was in the sidewalk for many years until it was moved by the condo association to a place up the street because they didn't want it in front of their building. And this was, again, an issue of some controversy in Boston. So you can see there's the plaque where the arrow is, and you can see the luxury condos in the background there. The street has been renamed, that goes right by that, has been named Coconut Grove name. But many people who have studied this fire, who have been involved with it, feel like there should be more information, more memory of the victims. So there's a memorial that will be placed in the nearby Statler Park to the club. This is where the park is. This is where the club was located. And the designs for this memorial have been made, and this is a rendering of it. You can see that it's going to be a simple arch that reflects the arches that were over the doorway to the revolving door in the Coconut Grove. It will also be emblazoned with bricks with the names of 490 victims there. Here is a rendering of what it will look like. And you might say, well, why have a memorial so many years later? Because we feel like this will be a focal point for further study and further information in this club. For example, there can be better and more computer models that can look at some of the material in this club, the trajectory of the fire, and maybe come up with some answers of why the fire moved so fast through the club. In 5 minutes, that fireball moved through the club. We might be able to understand that and use it as ways to prevent fire in the future. As I said, the studies on some of the material that was in the club are a little bit inconclusive, but there can be further studies on how we can continue to make material within clubs, within homes, within businesses a lot safer. So we feel that this memorial will serve as a sort of focal point for discussion. If you get the slides, I have some links to some resources. Coconutgrove.org is an amazing site put together by David Blaney. It's a huge database of all sorts of material. There's also the Boston Fire Historical Society. And plus, there's been a documentary on the fires, 6 Locked Doors, that may be available to rent for your organization. And I'd like to just conclude by saying it's been an honor to talk to you about this fire, as I said, is obsessed me over the course of 3 books. And I appreciate your attention. And I really hope that we can have some questions and perhaps some discussion. So thank you very much for your time.